A Jewish mother buys her adult son a brown shirt and a blue shirt for his birthday. Racked with nerves and guilt, he has a hard time choosing which one to wear to visit his mother, but eventually settles on the brown one. When his mother sees him, she immediately asks, "What, you don't like the blue shirt?" You may be picking up a theme here today: Jewish guilt. Although it can be funny, and Curb Your Enthusiasm proves that, it is much more than just a trope for jokes. Our Torah portion this week has a section all about guilt, and Jacob talked about it beautifully, and what our reaction is supposed to be to it. Segment of the sacrifices described are within the context of chet and ashem, sinning and then guilt. Depending upon the sin, the misdeed, whether it be intentional or unintentional, whether it causes harm to someone else or simply a lapse of purity, each time the prescription is different. But each prescription is based on the same internal human pattern: committing an act that renders the individual impure, whether that be a moral or physical impurity, and the individual feeling and then noting guilt for that act. The brilliant Torah scholar Aviva Zornberg puts it this way: to accept one's guilt, to find oneself Ashem, is to accept the unconscious into one's realm of responsibility. Unknowable, uncontrollable, the stranger within is acknowledged as mine. I identify with my own points of failure, my deadlocks. The role of guilt becomes more complex when the person committing the act does so purposefully. Most of our Torah passage is focused on inadvertent acts, but the end of the passage is all about those who willfully commit a forbidden act, such as defrauding or robbing a neighbor, stealing all the candy on Halloween. In particular, those acts committed in stealth are condemned. As one midrash tells us, the robber equates the dignity of the human with the dignity of God, while the thief does not equate the dignity of the human with the dignity of God. The thief acts as though the eyes of the Almighty were unable to see him, and God's ears were incapable of hearing him. He moves about stealthily while perpetrating his thievery, as though he can be seen by man but not by God. When one knows they're doing something wrong, and in fact knows so well that they're trying to hide it, it's worse than if one does something openly wrong. Even a robber can have their reasons that might, in their minds, make them righteous. Guilt is equated here with consciousness. Once one feels guilt about an act, one is conscious of it, and is therefore responsible for making the wrong they committed right. One who knowingly commits a crime and tries to hide it is therefore committing a double crime, both doing the initial damage and then acting as if their obfuscation can silence their guilt and therefore the God-granted impulse of guilt. If our ancient Israelite ancestors knew that guilt was a primary guide to how to repair breaches in our world, we too can use that same knowledge to make our world better. Rather than behaving like the thief in the Midrash, attempting to evade responsibility, we can use guilt to connect us more closely to God. We can see it as a call from God. Our Torah portion is in fact called Vayikra, and God called. We heed this call by recognizing that not only is it our responsibility to make up the tangible damages caused by our actions, but also to set ourselves right with the divine once we have realized our guilt. Today, we do not do this by sacrificing animals, just as Jacob said, but instead by looking at our own lives and seeking to find that which we can change within the most comfortable aspects of our life to keep us from committing these same wrongful acts once again. Guilt then is a guide to our own inner worlds and to how to be responsible for our own points of failure. Sometimes these points of failure are not even directly our fault, but they can still be our responsibility. And this is, in my estimation, the best use of our Torah portion today. In our culture, it's quite normal to try to avoid feelings of guilt. We work to recontextualize, to justify, to rationalize, to excuse ourselves, rather than simply accepting the feeling and using it as a guide to change or repair our behavior in our world. This happens both on a large scale when we consider issues of systemic injustice in our society, and on a small scale when we have committed an act that we know we should not have. One of the greatest problems that occurs when we ignore guilt is that it can become shame. Guilt isn't shame. Shame is when guilt is turned inward and taken as an intrinsic part of the self. Guilt is an emotion guiding us towards atonement for our previous actions, or even those systems that we benefit from which harm others. Shame leads us to shut down. Guilt can lead us to affect change. Often shame comes from things we feel we can't control. For instance, the accidents of our birth may lead us to be in positions in society that give us a great deal of privilege by no fault or merit of our own. Or perhaps we know of something our ancestors did that might cause us shame and may also have brought us privilege. It's much easier to feel shame and perhaps to harden ourselves to that feeling in these instances than to transmute it to guilt. The systems of the world that we encounter are so much bigger than us. They feel completely out of our control. But this isn't new. In this week's Haftarah portion, the prophet Isaiah is warning the Israelites about their guilt. He speaks for God, saying, "Your earliest ancestor sinned, and your spokesman transgressed against me." Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, may the memory of the righteous be a blessing, wrote on this theme, "Above all, the prophets remind us of the moral state of a people. Few are guilty, but all are responsible. If we admit that the individual is in some measure conditioned or affected by the spirit of society, an individual's crime discloses society's corruption. In a community not indifferent to suffering, uncompromisingly impatient with cruelty and falsehood, continually concerned for God and every person, crime would be infrequent rather than common." I would add to his words one thing. When you feel guilty, God is telling you that you are responsible. Let each of us listen for that voice inside, that pang of guilt that moves us to accept the unconscious into our own reality, that moves us towards repairing the spirit of our society, that moves us towards uncompromising impatience with cruelty and falsehoods. Let our Torah, let our God wake up our souls and create a pure heart within each of us towards a world in which we feel less and less these messages of guilt, not because we have blinded ourselves to them, not because we have transmuted them into shame, but because the world has become better by our efforts. Shabbat Shalom.